Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. In the battle against COVID, there are now fewer mask mandates, but more rules, some of which at the federal level go into effect next week. We'll look into what to expect, as well as examining the diminished condition of EMS service in New Orleans and one woman's horror story from being in a nursing facility. A series of elections across the nation this past week may have sent a message about local politics, and we will look at the career of a trumpet player who will be going to prison for defrauding the New Orleans Public Library. Coincidentally, our Future Watch segment examines the current need and condition of libraries. We begin, though, with news of the FBI gathering documents at the office of the Sewage and Water Board this morning. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, LeBron Joseph, news anchor and reporter, WGNO-TV Channel 26, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Mike Pearlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. And we're going to stay with Mike. This morning, the FBI visited the New Orleans Sewage and Water Board offices.
Yes, and this was one of the quickest reactions I've seen from federal law enforcement to a media story that I can remember. My colleague David Hammer broke a story last night on Sewage and Water Board inspectors kind of double dipping, doing private jobs on public time, signing off on, jobs for other people who didn't have the proper qualifications and permits. And by this morning, the FBI is at the Sewage and Water Board headquarters on Joseph Street, raiding the plumbing department, taking away boxes of paper records. And of course, David Hammer and our photographer were there to capture all this. Interestingly, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be, a lot more stories by David on this, but it really looks like the people in question have some serious, questions that they need to answer, not just from the FBI, but the Sewage and Water Board director, Ghassan Korban, immediately came out and said they're cooperating. There had already been problems inside City Hall inspections with some people, fired from those jobs and criminally charged. And it looks like the same thing is taking place now at the Sewage and Water Board.
And so the focus is on gas connections, is that right, and inspections?
Right. So it takes a specific type of license to make the kind of connections to, hot water heaters, stoves, because those involve gas lines. And some people who have a plumbing license but not the gas connection license were doing these jobs, but having the Sewage and Water Board employees who do have the gas connection license coming in and signing off. Well, how is that happening on all days of the week, all hours of a day, when they're supposed to be working 8 hours a day at their public jobs at the Sewage and Water Board?
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be looking for more about that. I mean, gas connections are a really important thing. That is such a safety issue.
And dangerous.
Yeah. Yep. All right, Mike, thanks a lot. Let's go on over to LeBron right now. And latest on COVID and some new federal laws, rules about COVID vaccination that some people aren't really very happy about.
Yeah, Marcia, as it relates to COVID, COVID is not over. Certainly here in the state of Louisiana, overnight, 538 cases, another 18 new deaths, still a couple hundred people in the hospital. So COVID is not done in Louisiana or across America. One big deal that happened this week is the beginning of vaccines for kids 5 to 11. Got some video and some pictures and some news briefs and all that earlier today from all of the local outlets that are now providing vaccines for younger kids as well. So that is a big deal, and the hopes are pretty high that will help sort of keep the numbers down in schools, certainly, and at home during the holidays, if you will.
Right.
But what has made more noise than anything is the federal emergency standard, and that's what it's being called, that was issued by OSHA. Certainly, this is the Biden administration's attempt to vaccinate as many people as possible, and this certainly affecting in the workplace all federal employees. and this extends to people with federal contracts as well, those large contractors who do have federal contracts, medical centers, or healthcare workers. And when I talk about medical centers, any receiving Medicaid or Medicare dollars. And this even stretches into the private sector for companies with over 100 employees. And what needs to happen by January 4th, although this is going into effect in the coming days, by January 4th, everyone will either have to be vaccinated or will have to be tested weekly. Companies that violate this or that are found in violation of this could be fined up to $14,000 per employee. And that has gotten the attention of a whole lot of folks. The lawsuits are already flying. In fact, our own Attorney General, Jeff Landry, filed a lawsuit yesterday on behalf of the federal contractors, people that have these federal contracts, if you will. His lawsuit today addresses the legality of the federal temporary emergency standard. And he is not alone. I think I've read up to 20 to 25 by now that have been filed in the last 2 days across the country.
There are religious exemptions for this, right?
Yep, there are religious,
And health
there are
exemptions
medical.
too. Yeah,
Yep.
medical, okay.
Religious and medical exemptions. I tend to believe that they won't be doling those out too easily if, in fact, this stands. Now, the Biden administration has said from the very beginning that they feel as if they're on pretty firm legal footing for this particular deal. We will certainly find out by the number of legal challenges coming across the country. And I tend to believe that you will find a judge or two or five that will side with people saying, hey, this is a bit of an overreach of the federal government. So it'll be pretty interesting.
It certainly will be. Okay, thanks a lot, LeBron.
Sure.
Let's go back on over to Mike right now. And in Orleans Parish, there's a problem with EMS response, and there had been a problem also with 911, some recordings when people call 911. So how's it all looking?
Yeah, another day, another problem with our first responders. And earlier we had exposed that some people calling 911 could get a recorded message instead of a human being answering the phone. Well, it turns out a much larger, deeper, and more longstanding problem is, getting through in a medical emergency, requesting an ambulance through New Orleans EMS, but there is just no ambulance available. These are actually logged as NUA, no unit available, by EMS, and it happens in the hundreds of times per week. Now, there are backup ambulances. There's mutual aid from private operators like Acadian Ambulance Service, for example. At times, West Jefferson or East Jefferson will also take those calls that EMS can't get to. Most recently, first because of COVID, and then they lingered on a little longer because of Hurricane Ida, were federally funded surge ambulances that's paid for by FEMA. And at one point, very dramatically, there were more surge ambulances, 18, than there were actual New Orleans EMS units, 16, on the street. Well, now those surge ambulances have left and gone back to their jurisdictions, leaving EMS incredibly shorthanded to the point where some medical calls just are not going to be answered by an ambulance. Now, the fire department steps in when they can. Sometimes it'll be a whole ladder truck from your nearest fire department, where most of those firefighters are at least trained EMTs, emergency medical technicians, enough to stabilize a patient, but they cannot transport to a hospital. So there's still a wait for an ambulance on the scene. And it really was described very bluntly by Dr. Emily Nichols, director of New Orleans EMS, as a crisis. She said that it has reached a point of being dire at times, and they've asked for additional funding in this city budget cycle. One of the issues are people, both EMTs and paramedics, leaving because of both the COVID stress and low pay. It is something of a national problem where if you look at medical professionals, nurses, doctors, under such incredible stress for nearly 2 years with COVID, well, EMTs, paramedics make a fraction of what nurses and doctors make, working in arguably more strenuous conditions, out on the street, rushing to scenes, dealing with everything from the standard medical emergencies, heart attacks and strokes, to gunshot victims. So it's a real crisis in New Orleans.
So it's a staffing problem, but also an equipment problem. I mean, so many of the ambulances are in the shop.
And that was just kind of another alarming edge to this whole problem. There were times when they got people back from COVID and had just enough staff, but so many ambulances were out for repair that they'd send people home. There was no ambulance for them to ride in. There were 40 ambulances. At one point, it got down to, I think, 16 operating units. They're up to 19 now. So it's still fewer than half of their 40 ambulances are on the street running.
So surrounding parishes, are they seeing the same problems, or can they pitch in and help with this shortage?
Okay, they do pitch in. They can and they do. And far too frequently, for the comfort level of New Orleans EMS, because they can only stretch so far helping out New Orleans, but they do not get nearly the call volume, both on the West Bank, where we would get West Jeff ambulances, and on the East Bank, where we would get East Jefferson ambulances pitching in. And the call volume in New Orleans has, really, held in normal times, already very, very high, but COVID sent it through the roof. And so the strain has just been tremendous on our EMS resources.
All right, Mike, thanks a lot. We're going to go over to Errol right now. Elections around the country. What do you read from the results?
Well, historically, I don't know why they chose this date, but I guess Ben Franklin probably picked it. But the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November has always been an election day. It's the federal election day. And so in leap years, that's when you have the presidential race. And then 2 years after that, you have the so-called off-year elections. This year was the election in between the federal and the off-year. So it was 1 year after the presidential race. But people use that, too, as kind of a sounding board. And the state of Virginia schedules its gubernatorial election in that 1 year after the presidential election. And that becomes sort of, the press kind of looks at it as a test on the president's popularity, especially with Virginia being so near to Washington. So it got a lot of attention. It usually votes Democrat. One of the candidates was a Democrat who had been governor. You can't succeed yourself, so you have to skip a term, but he was running again, a guy named Terry McAuliffe. And the other guy was the Republican candidate was a guy named Glenn Youngkin, who's a businessman, never ran for office, started off as a real long shot, put together an incredible campaign, and won. And this was like a real shock to see him win. He's a very good candidate, and to see him election night was really interesting. And so that was one of the big surprises, that maybe there's a little bit of a movement towards the conservative side. But as elections came in across the country, what people were noticing is that there seems to be a backlash, not against the Democratic Party per se, but what people are seeing as being the extreme Democratic Party, that maybe it's moved too far to the left. This is not the Democratic Party of John Bell Edwards. This is something else that wants to defund the police, and that wants to take Abe Lincoln's statue down and all that. And there's just a lot of reaction. There's a lot of hostility across the nation. There was also hostility. This was really the first major election since all the COVID and the school closings. There are a lot of angry parents out there who didn't want to see the schools closed as long as they did, who felt they had no say-so, that it was the unions who ruled that. But while the kids were at home, they saw what was being taught to the kids, and they weren't always happy with that. And so they kind of felt like they were losing control over the schools. Yeah. The guy in Virginia, the incumbent, or the former incumbent, McAuliffe, even said something in a debate like, well, it's not for parents to decide what the curriculum is. Well, that didn't play well in Virginia. And that was part of the backlash there.
And of course, in Minneapolis, the doing away with the police department failed.
The defund of police was a big issue across the country, and it was a shock when it was defeated in Minneapolis, which is a very liberal city. In Seattle, it was defeated, In New York, New York elected a new mayor who's black, but he's a former police captain who's very much in favor of funding the police.
Right.
And so anytime you saw this issue, you saw strong support. And James Carville, who's a very, very loyal Democrat, who worked in the Virginia campaign, was just furious the next day. And he says, all of this woke stuff is stupid, and it's hurting, and that was his word, and it's hurting the Democratic Party. So there's been really a big debate in the country about has the party gone too far.
All righty. All right, E, thanks a lot. We have to move along right now. Let's go on over to LeBron. Irvin Mayfield has been sentenced.
Yep, sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, along with 3 years of supervised probation and paying back $1.1 million. He and Ronald Markham were given the same sentence a couple of days ago by the federal judge Jay Zaney. And the judge, throughout the day, Ben, went through great pains to sort of explain where he sat on this whole thing, saying that, hey, the sentence I give you will be not enough for some people. On the other hand, it will be too much. But you are going to spend some time in jail. And he said that on a couple of occasions, and eventually handing out the sentence. Mayfield and Markham both apologized to the city, their families. They apologized to the library folks. And apologized to the judge as well. This was the first time that we got a chance to hear them in court as it relates to this, and not speaking when lawyers are, for the most part, the most bizarre part of the entire day would probably have been, you mentioned the great David Hammer earlier, Mike, and David had covered this case in the media pretty extensively. The defense attorney attacked Hammer toward the end of wrapping up what he had to say, saying that David had done over 60 stories on this. The judge was quick to point out that David's work had absolutely nothing to do with the crime that had been committed.
Let's remind the viewers the crime that committed was taking $1.3 million from the Library Foundation.
That is exactly what the deal is. And at the end of the day, you know, it's an interesting thing. Irvin Mayfield, as a musician, and Errol and I were speaking a bit earlier about this, he is a musician, brilliant musician, no question, but also always had a bit more ambition than just playing his horn. And one of the few musicians whose work extended beyond that, certainly had been named cultural ambassador by the former mayor at Nagin. He taught a couple of courses over at UNO, had the Playhouse over at the Royal Sonesta, was on the board of the Library Foundation as well, and then became, I think, president of that board, and that's where they moved those funds from there to another organization that they had started, the New Orleans Jazz Market, which became the home for the Jazz Orchestra. And that house of cards of moving that money around is what fell, and the judge said that, hey, this was a crime of ego and greed.
And so sentence starts in January.
January 3rd.
All right.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, LeBron. And talking about libraries, we'll keep talking about libraries with Dawn right now. How's it looking for Orleans Parish Libraries?
Well, that whole fiasco with Irvin Mayfield and Markham really did hurt the fundraising efforts of the libraries. They're hoping to get back on track with the Library Foundation and getting money back in for their valuable programs, and really starting to focus on their 10-year program, which is three-part, focusing on smart kids, early childhood education, a ready workforce with adult literacy, digital literacy, and workforce development, and open doors, focusing on library operations like circulation and internet access and those sort of things. The library system, it's not our libraries from, you know, when you went every week after school and picked up your books and returned them every week. The library is a lot more about digital access and computers today than it used to be. And COVID certainly hurt that. So let's go back to early COVID days when the library was able to reopen, but not reopen the way anyone knew it in terms of circulation and access. You would have to go by appointment. items that were returned would have to sit in quarantine for a while. Remember back when we used to think COVID maybe would live on the books or the digital devices for too long, so people couldn't use them. So that really, really hurt. Then Ida came along and closed the libraries down again and shut off power. They were able to get back open pretty quickly and provide some internet access as well as air conditioning to the New Orleans population. The hours, however, at New Orleans public libraries and really across the region are still limited by both COVID and staffing and Ida. So there are currently no Sunday in-person hours at Orleans Parish Public Libraries. All of the libraries, bar one, which is under construction in Orleans Parish, are back up and running. But the hours are still small. They're finished at 5 o'clock in the afternoon at most of our public libraries. Again, no Sunday hours. Damage didn't really happen during Ida to at least the Orleans Parish system, so that's good. They were able to stay up and online. But the library's having to do much more outreach than they once did. It used to be, the place everybody knew to go. Now it's the place that they do the outreach to get everybody there. For instance, they send the applications for library cards to regional schools, and kids can fill out the applications at school, and then their library cards are delivered there. They also will have a book by mail program where books are actually delivered to people who can't get to the library, and then all of that digital access. You need to fill out your FEMA application. You need to get a blue tarp. You need all of these things that folks have to do lately occurs online. So they provide a lot of that online access for the members of the community.
To actually go to a library and have access to a computer or
access to the
internet, yeah.
Both, the computer and the internet. So it really is a changing resource in America, but there is still definite, Errol asked me if they'd all close and be factories. Absolutely not. And one thing that was limited after Ida that I found myself, we do a lot of digital book downloads from the library, and that you couldn't do when there was no power. So you didn't have access to those digital books. But they're coming back.
Yeah, so you can access the collection digitally too,
right,
from your home. Okay, you don't have to go there and.
Right, and you can download a book and read it and return it and download it onto a device instead of having the book in your hands.
So libraries still have an important place in our lives.
Absolutely, and hopefully they can get past this fiasco and start raising some funds again to do the good work they do. All their community programs, however, like read-alongs and that sort of thing, they were all banned during COVID and then happened outdoors. They're just starting up again at a select few libraries with distancing and other rules in place.
Okay, making adjustments. All right, thanks a lot, Dawn. Let's go on over to Mike right now. And there's just such a sad, sad story of a woman who was in rehab and then for Ida was transferred to that warehouse in Independence, was it? Where 800 people were sent from nursing homes, and it really, really caused her some problems.
Yeah, there were 7 nursing homes owned by a businessman by the name of Bob Dean Jr., and his evacuation plan in the case of a hurricane was to move these patients, it turned out to be 843 of them, to a warehouse, a former industrial warehouse that he owns in Independence, Louisiana. It was, as we've now seen from footage and images, poorly equipped, mostly mattresses on the floor, portalettes lined up against the wall. The one patient that I connected with, her name is Lisa Renard, 62-year-old woman, who was not really a nursing home patient. She was in the West Jefferson Healthcare Center, owned by Bob Dean, rehabbing after having one leg amputated below the knee due to diabetes. And in the process of working with a prosthetic leg, getting her back to her job at a daycare center, Hurricane Ida bears down. She ends up evacuated with everybody else and stuck inside this warehouse in a wheelchair for the duration, 4 days. Had to go to the bathroom on herself. Wasn't able to use any of those mats or mattresses on the ground, and she started having severe medical issues with her other leg. And turns out that gangrene set in. By the time the State Department of Health came to essentially rescue the patients from that warehouse and send them to hospitals and other nursing facilities around the state, she can barely remember. She was literally on death's door due to gangrene. Ended up at Baton Rouge General Hospital when she woke up in a recovery room she found out that her other leg had been amputated, and this time, above the knee. Interesting that just today, a couple of investigators with the Attorney General's office went to interview Lisa Renard as part of their investigation, both a criminal and administrative investigation. The administrative is with basically the revocation of the 7 nursing home licenses. That looks to be a battle in administrative court, but the Attorney General also vowed to look for possible criminal violations of neglect. We know that of the deaths of those patients in that nursing home, 5 were attributed directly to the conditions and the chaotic evacuation. We've gotten footage from inside that warehouse that showed that not only Lisa Renard was stuck in a wheelchair, but many other patients. Water began leaking. They had to, essentially move patients who were in the leaky portions of the warehouse to already jam-packed sections, that were overcrowded. And it was just a chaotic situation with some really tragic outcomes that will be sorted out through now. I think it's up to 12 different lawsuits. As well as the state investigation.
And meanwhile, Dean's nursing homes, they're not open right now. They're suspended for a year, is it?
Well, those licenses were revoked, and it was Dean's attorney himself who put a notice of appeal to fight the revocations that the discovery is going to take at least a year so that they can respond in court, administrative court, and so those facilities look to be closed for at least a year.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mike. Time for other stories. Over to you.
Well, next week is election day for some local elections. The runoff date will be December 11th, but also on the December 11th ballot for people in St. Tammany Parish will be the referendum for that casino, for moving the casino from Bossier City to Slidell. That's going to be a major issue. So that'll be December 11th.
All right. Thanks a lot. LeBron, over to you.
I got a chance earlier this week to ask FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell about the slowness of getting people temporary housing in some of the bayou parishes and all that have been hit pretty hard. She mentioned that the model, and that it is a slow going from FEMA's process, but the model that the state is using of buying these mobile homes and distributing them may be the model for the future for other states and other disasters. I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, I hope it goes a little bit faster.
Yes.
Dawn, over to you real quick.
Hard to believe we're already here. 2 weeks from today is the preview party for Celebration in the Oaks. The official holiday celebration in City Park opens on Thanksgiving.
Wonderful. Okay, Mike, wrap up with you.
Yeah, there's a real interesting, kind of coming out of the pandemic question that everyone's asking: where are the workers? Restaurants, hotels, it's just hard to get appointments for just about anything. And Channel 4 next Tuesday night is going to attempt to answer that big question that's affecting everybody as we're coming out of this global pandemic.
Okay, we'll be looking for that answer. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, too. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.